The Nestlé Corporation is the largest food and beverage company on Earth. A name whispered in nearly every kitchen, stamped onto shelves across continents, wrapped in the language of comfort and nourishment. Its brands feel familiar, almost harmless. Yet behind this vast global presence lies an empire whose origins, contradictions, and consequences cast a long and troubling shadow. Nestlé was founded in 1866 by Henri Nestlé, a man remembered as a humanitarian innovator. His invention, Farine Lactée, the world's first commercially successful infant cereal, was hailed as a miracle. It promised survival to babies who could not be breastfed. From this single product grew a dynasty built on a seductive promise: good food, good life. But history has a way of revealing what marketing conceals. For more than 150 years, Nestlé has shaped global nutrition and consumer behavior on an almost unimaginable scale. The corporation controls over 2,000 brands, from Nescafé and KitKat to Perrier, operates in 186 countries, and generates more than $105 billion in annual revenue. Yet beneath this polished surface trails a record of persistent and deeply disturbing controversies. The Nestlé kills babies boycott of the 1970s, ongoing allegations of child slave labor in cocoa production, the privatization of public water sources, and repeated accusations of selling contaminated food to millions. The question lingers like a stain: was Nestlé's foundation truly humanitarian, or merely the first mask of an unstoppable corporate machine? Henri Nestlé was born Heinrich Nestlé in 1814 in Frankfurt, Germany, into a respectable middle-class family of merchants and glassmakers. He was the 11th of 14 children, raised during the turbulence of the industrial and scientific revolutions. Trained as a pharmacist's assistant, his education blended chemistry, botany, and medicine, disciplines that promised control over nature itself. In 1833, Nestlé left Germany. Official company history cites political reasons. His family's ties to liberal revolutionary movements made remaining dangerous in an increasingly conservative climate. He settled in Vevey, a quiet French-speaking Swiss town on the shores of Lake Geneva. There, he changed his name to the more French-sounding Henri, and, in 1843, opened a small business. At first, it had nothing to do with infant food. Nestlé was a tinkerer of the 19th century, producing nut oils, liqueurs, vinegar, and mineral water, modest goods for a modest life. But Europe was drowning in a silent catastrophe. By the mid-19th century, industrialization had transformed cities into overcrowded, unsanitary slums. Millions were pulled from rural life into factories. For new mothers, breastfeeding was often impossible. Malnutrition, exhaustion, and 14-hour workdays separated women from their infants. Alternatives were deadly. Wet nurses were costly and unregulated. Animal milk was frequently unpasteurized, contaminated with tuberculosis and bacteria, and nearly indigestible for newborns. The result was mass death. In many European cities, infant mortality reached 25%. 1 in 4 babies never saw their first birthday. Malnutrition and gastrointestinal disease became quiet executioners. Henri Nestlé saw not only tragedy, but opportunity, a scientific problem waiting for a solution. He began to experiment. His goal was precision, a stable, safe, digestible infant food. Using Swiss cow's milk, added sugar for carbohydrates, and wheat flour baked to remove indigestible starch, he engineered a formula that mimicked nourishment while bypassing nature. The result was Farine Lactée. In 1867, the product was tested. According to company legend, a premature infant, too weak to survive on mother's milk or any substitute, was fed Nestlé's formula and lived. This single story became the foundation myth of the corporation. Whether miracle or marketing, it was powerful. Nestlé adopted his family's coat of arms as a logo, A mother bird feeding her young in a nest. Safety. Care. Trust. Sales exploded. From 500 cans a year to 1 million within a few seasons, farine lactée spread across Europe. An entirely new industry was born. But Nestlé was not alone. In the same year, 1866, two American brothers, Charles and George Page, founded the Anglo-Swiss Condensed Milk Company in Cham, Switzerland. Their product targeted adults, thick, sweet, shelf-stable condensed milk. For a decade, the two companies fought fiercely for dominance. And according to some historical accounts, it was within this early rivalry that the darker instincts of the Nestlé business culture first began to take shape. Instincts that would echo far beyond the 19th century, and far beyond infant food. What began as salvation was already learning how to consume the world. The company was repeatedly accused of anti-competitive behavior, attempts to steal formulas, sabotage rivals, and lure away clients from competitors such as the German firm Liebig. Yet in the brutal business climate of the late 19th century, these tactics were considered almost normal. The age rewarded aggression. But Henri Nestlé himself was not a robber baron. He was not driven by conquest. He was an inventor who had accidentally unleashed an industrial monster. By the 1870s, he was over 60 years old, wealthy, exhausted, and burdened by a global enterprise he had never intended to build. Like his own father, he had no children to inherit the empire. In 1875, in a decision that revealed his true nature, he sold everything: the company, the factory, the formula, even the right to his name, to a group of Swiss businessmen for 1 million francs. It was a staggering fortune for the time. Henri Nestlé retired quietly. He funded a local hospital in Vevey, lived modestly, and died in 1890, decades before the corporation bearing his gentle logo would become one of the most controversial entities in modern history. The men who replaced him were different. The new owners had no humanitarian hesitation. They were not scientists. They were capitalists. And they immediately unleashed an aggressive campaign of global expansion. Nestle-branded infant formula was pushed far beyond Europe, deep into the colonial territories of Africa and Asia. This moment would later be called the company's original sin. In the late 1890s and early 1900s, Nestle sales agents, often disguised as milk nurses, entered developing regions where medical infrastructure was weak and literacy rates were low. They presented the formula as a modern, scientific alternative to breast milk. Critics would later argue that this early strategy planted the seeds of a humanitarian catastrophe that would fully erupt decades later. It was the first time Nestle was accused of placing profit above the survival of the most vulnerable humans on Earth. A pattern was forming. In 1905, a major transformation occurred. The long rivalry that had defined the Swiss milk industry came to an end. Nestle merged with its former enemy, the Anglo-Swiss Condensed Milk Company, creating the Nestle and Anglo-Swiss Condensed Milk Company, a corporate colossus with factories in the United States, Britain, Germany, and Spain. War accelerated everything. During World War I, and later World War II, Nestle became a critical supplier of processed milk and chocolate to the armies of Europe. Switzerland was officially neutral, but Nestle was not confined by borders. It operated factories on both sides of the conflict. To critics, this was not neutrality, it was opportunism. Nestle supplied condensed milk and chocolate to German and Austro-Hungarian forces while simultaneously feeding British, French, and later American troops. The US government became one of its largest customers, ordering millions of cans as field rations. Nestle was playing both sides, extracting profit from global bloodshed. The label, War Profiteer, would follow the company ever after, reinforcing the perception that its only loyalty was to its balance sheet. This era also produced Nestle's second great invention, one that would surpass even infant formula in profitability. In 1938, on the eve of another global war, Nestlé scientist Max Morgenthaler was tasked with solving a problem for the Brazilian government, which was drowning in surplus coffee beans. His solution was revolutionary. By freeze-drying coffee, he created the world's first truly successful instant coffee, Nescafé. Lightweight, nearly immortal, requiring only hot water. Once again, the military was the first major customer. When the United States entered World War II, it purchased Nestlé's entire Nescafé production. Every American soldier carried it. By the war's end, the company Henri Nestlé had founded was unrecognizable, a global titan forged by 2 world wars, powered by mass consumption and conflict. In the post-war boom, now led by professional managers rather than family heirs, Nestlé embarked on a relentless campaign of acquisitions. This strategy would define the modern corporation. In 1947, it acquired Maggi, dominating the savory food market. It absorbed Cross and Blackwell in Britain. Earlier, it had already consolidated Swiss chocolate giants such as Peter, Kahler, and Kohler. Nestlé was no longer a milk company. It was becoming omnipresent. But the product that had started everything, infant formula, was about to ignite the greatest scandal in the company's history. A scandal that would permanently stain the image of the mother bird and give birth to a slogan that echoed across decades: Nestlé kills babies. By the 1960s, formula sales in Europe and North America were stagnating. Medical consensus was shifting. Breastfeeding was once again recognized as essential. For Nestlé, this was an existential threat. Their response was surgical. They turned to the developing world, Africa, Asia, Latin America, regions with exploding populations, weak regulation, and a deep desire for Western modernity. Alongside companies like Ross and Bristol-Myers, Nestlé launched what health organizations would later describe as one of the most unethical marketing campaigns in corporate history. The goal was clear: destroy breastfeeding and replace it with dependency. Thousands of local women were hired, dressed in white nurse-like uniforms, and sent into maternity wards across Nigeria, Kenya, Brazil, and the Philippines. These milk nurses were not medical professionals. They were commissioned sales agents. They told new mothers that their breast milk was insufficient, outdated, even dangerous, and that science had a better answer. Free samples followed. Enough for a few days. It was a trap. After several days without breastfeeding, a woman's milk supply naturally declines. When the free samples ended, her body could no longer feed her child. She was forced to buy formula. Dependency was complete. Add to this mass advertising, billboards, radio jingles, images of fat, smiling Nestlé babies, and the illusion was total. The campaign worked. Formula sales in the developing world exploded, driving Nestlé's profits through the 1970s. But beneath the numbers, something far darker was unfolding, something that would soon attract global outrage, medical condemnation, and a boycott that would shake the corporation to its core. And this time, the bodies could not be hidden. But the human cost was nothing short of a holocaust. The marketing campaign was built on 2 fatal lies, lies that were not accidental, and in many cases were fully understood by those who engineered them. The first lie was that infant formula was safer than breast milk. In the controlled environments of Europe, this claim was already questionable. In the developing world, it was lethal. The second lie was even more devastating, that mothers in these countries could use the product safely. They could not. And the reason was water. Nestlé's formula was sold as a fine powder, requiring precise mixing with clean water. But the vast majority of its new customers lived in rural villages or urban slums without access to potable water. They mixed the formula with water drawn from rivers, shallow wells, roadside ditches, water often teeming with cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and parasitic infections. What had been marketed as nourishment became a direct delivery system for deadly waterborne disease. Then came the problem of literacy. Instructions on the tins were printed in English, French, or German, languages many mothers could not read. Even for those who could, the required sterilization procedures bordered on fantasy. Boil water for 10 minutes. Sterilize bottles and nipples. Measure exact quantities. For families living in one-room huts with a single cooking pot and limited, costly firewood or charcoal, these instructions were impossible to follow. The product assumed infrastructure that simply did not exist. And then came poverty, the most merciless factor of all. Formula was ruinously expensive. A single can could consume 20 to 30% of a family's weekly income. Mothers, desperate to keep their babies alive, tried to make it last. They diluted the formula, 1 scoop instead of 2, then 3 times the water, then more. The powder thinned. The nutrition vanished. What emerged was a deadly feedback loop known to health workers as the infant formula cycle. A baby fed overdiluted formula became chronically undernourished. Severe protein-energy malnutrition, marasmus, left the child skeletal, weak, and vulnerable. At the same time, the contaminated water caused relentless diarrhea and gastroenteritis. Each episode stripped the child of the few nutrients it received, accelerating the decline. The mother, watching her baby waste away, concluded that her own breast milk must be defective. She turned even more desperately to the formula, unknowingly tightening the noose. The cycle had one inevitable outcome: infant death. By the early 1970s, hospitals and aid workers across Africa, Asia, and Latin America were seeing the pattern repeated endlessly. Entire wards filled with dying babies. Doctors sounded alarms. But the corporate machine continued. In 1974, a British advocacy group called War on Want published a devastating 28-page report exposing the crisis. Written by investigative journalist Mike Miller, it carried a title that detonated like a bomb: The Baby Killer. The report meticulously documented the marketing practices of the infant formula industry and identified Nestle as its most aggressive and culpable actor. It described the milk nurses, the free samples, the deceptive advertising. And it did something unprecedented. It placed responsibility for the deaths of thousands of infants directly on a corporation. The mother bird logo, the report argued, was a lie. When the report was translated into German by a Swiss activist group, they chose an even more explosive title: Nestle tötet babies. Nestle kills babies. For the first time, the untouchable Swiss giant faced a threat it could not simply absorb or silence. Nestle's response was not reform. It was retaliation. In 1974, inside the pristine headquarters in Vevey, Nestle executives made a catastrophic calculation. Nestle was Switzerland's crown jewel, a symbol of neutrality, precision, and quality. And now a handful of students and left-wing activists in Bern, calling themselves the Third World Working Group, had dared to challenge that image. The slogan was unforgivable. So Nestle decided to crush them. The corporation filed a massive libel lawsuit, not abroad, but at home, in Bern, Switzerland. It was an act of supreme corporate arrogance. What Nestle failed to understand was that it had just handed its critics the most powerful weapon imaginable: a public courtroom. The trial, which began in 1975 and dragged on for 2 years, ceased to be about libel almost immediately. It became a global tribunal on corporate ethics. Journalists from around the world descended on Bern. The courtroom transformed into something closer to a modern Nuremberg trial for multinational corporations. Nestle's elite legal team focused on technicalities. They argued definitions. What did it mean to kill? Could a corporation be responsible for outcomes several steps removed from its actions? The activists argued something far simpler. They presented doctors, nurses, medical studies, photographs of dying children. They showed how Nestle's marketing deliberately undermined breastfeeding, created dependency, and then abandoned mothers to impossible conditions. The court ultimately ruled that while the activists' language was inflammatory, the underlying facts were true. Nestle was fined a symbolic amount. But the damage was irreversible. The phrase "Nestle kills babies" circled the globe. What followed was one of the largest consumer boycotts in history. Churches, universities, hospitals, and governments joined. The World Health Organization drafted the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes in 1981, a direct response to Nestle and its peers. Nestle publicly claimed compliance. Critics documented continued violations for decades. And the scandal never truly ended. To this day, accusations of unethical marketing, regulatory evasion, and exploitation of vulnerable populations continue to surface. The Nestle story revealed a core philosophy that many believe still defines the corporation: that emerging markets are not communities to be protected, but territories to be conquered. What began as a cradle became a marketplace. And for millions of children, the cost of that transformation was paid in silence, graves, and statistics that will never fully be counted. And to Nestle's critics, the conclusion was unavoidable: that the deaths of up to 1.5 million infants a year were considered an acceptable cost of doing business. The infant formula scandal, which haunted the corporation for more than 3 decades, was not an isolated failure. It was the prototype. A rehearsal. A proof of concept. From child slaves to water vampires, the Nestle kills babies scandal of the 1970s and 1980s exposed something far more disturbing than a single unethical campaign. It revealed the core operating system of the Nestle dynasty itself: identify the world's most vulnerable populations, manufacture dependency, and extract profit at industrial scale. The boycott and the World Health Organization's International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes were severe blows. But they did not change Nestle's underlying philosophy. They merely forced it to evolve. The lesson the company learned was not stop exploiting. It was learn to hide it better. While global attention remained fixed on infant formula, the same predatory model was being refined in 2 vastly larger markets: cocoa and water. This was the second and third act of the Nestle tragedy. The company accused of killing babies would now stand accused of enslaving children and draining entire communities dry. The first of these scandals was hidden inside the sweetest products Nestle sells: chocolate. Kit Kat, Crunch, Aero, Toll House. Brands wrapped in childhood nostalgia and indulgence. But their primary ingredient, cocoa, comes from one of the poorest and most brutal supply chains on Earth. The global cocoa industry is effectively a duopoly. Nearly 70% of the world's cocoa is produced in just 2 countries, Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. Nestle, alongside Mars and Hershey, is one of the dominant buyers. Nestle alone sources an estimated 30% of its cocoa from this single volatile region. And this supply chain, as documented by journalists, NGOs, and governments for decades, is built on child labor, not incidental, not accidental, but structural. The most damning evidence came in 2020 from a study by NORC at the University of Chicago, funded by the U.S. Department of Labor. Its findings were unequivocal. 1.56 million children were engaged in hazardous labor on cocoa farms in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. Hazardous labor is a bureaucratic euphemism for a childhood destroyed. Children as young as 10, often younger, work 12-hour days for little or no pay. They swing razor-sharp machetes to hack cocoa pods from trees. They haul 100-pound sacks of beans through jungle heat. They spray crops with toxic pesticides, barefoot, gloveless, unprotected. Many suffer permanent injuries. Some disappear entirely. Worse still is the trafficking. Thousands of these children are not working for their families. They are slaves. Traffickers lure or purchase children from poorer neighboring countries like Burkina Faso with false promises of education or wages. These children are sold to farm owners, trapped for years, beaten if they attempt escape. Their existence vanishes into supply chains that stretch directly to Western supermarkets. Nestle has known about this reality for decades. The scandal first broke in the late 1990s. In 2001, the chocolate industry, including Nestle, signed the Harkin-Engel Protocol, a voluntary agreement pledging to eliminate the worst forms of child labor by 2005. The deadline passed. It was moved to 2008, then 2010, then 2020. Now, it stands at 2025. Every deadline has been missed. The most significant legal confrontation came in 2005, when 6 men from Mali filed a lawsuit in U.S. federal court. They alleged that they had been trafficked as children and forced to work as slaves on Ivorian cocoa farms supplying Nestle. The case argued that Nestle had aided and abetted slavery under the Alien Tort Statute. Nestle's defense was revealing. The company did not deny that child slavery existed. It argued instead that it was not legally responsible. Nestle claimed it was a Swiss corporation, operating through intermediaries, buying cocoa on global markets. The farms were not owned by Nestle. Therefore, the suffering was not its problem. In June 2021, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Nestle's favor. It was a legal victory, not a moral one. The court did not declare Nestle innocent. It declared the case procedurally flawed. But the evidence exposed during the trial painted a grim picture. Plaintiffs' lawyers argued that Nestle knew exactly what was happening. They presented evidence showing the company had economic leverage over farms, controlled pricing, and could have enforced reforms. They argued that child labor was not a bug in the system, it was the system. Cheap cocoa depended on cheap labor, and cheap labor depended on children. The response followed the familiar Nestle playbook. Legal obstruction. Public relations. A glossy initiative. In 2009, Nestle launched the Nestle Cocoa Plan, a 110 million Swiss franc program promising better farming, better lives, better cocoa. Schools would be built. Farmers trained. Child labor monitored. On paper, it was flawless. In reality, critics from Fair Trade International and the World Bank pointed out the fatal flaw. The plan treated symptoms while preserving the disease. The World Bank estimates that 60% of cocoa farmers in Côte d'Ivoire live in extreme poverty, less than $2 a day. Nestle and its competitors, as dominant buyers, exert enormous influence over global cocoa prices. Critics argue this power has been used for decades to keep prices artificially low. Farmers trapped by these prices face a brutal choice: make their own children work, or buy trafficked ones. Against this backdrop, the Cocoa Plan looks less like reform and more like camouflage. The 2020 NORC report confirmed its failure. 45% of child laborers in the region were still not attending school. But even this was not the end. The same predatory logic reached its purest form in Nestle's control of the most essential substance for human survival: water. Nestle is the largest bottled water company on Earth. Its brands range from luxury labels like Perrier and S. Pellegrino to mass-market products like Nestle Pure Life. Pure Life is marketed aggressively in developing nations using the same message once used for formula: modern, safe, superior. The model is brutally simple. Nestle does not make water. It extracts it. The company identifies communities with clean groundwater, purchases small parcels of land, sinks industrial wells, and pumps millions of gallons, often for negligible fees. That public water is bottled in single-use plastic and sold back to the population at markups of thousands of %. The damage is not theoretical. In the Pakistani village of Badi Dilwan, Nestle built a Pure Life bottling plant in the early 2000s. For years, it pumped relentlessly from the local aquifer. According to The Guardian, village wells that had sustained families for generations ran dry. The water table collapsed. The final cruelty was complete. Villagers who once had free, clean water were forced to drink contaminated surface water, or buy bottled water from the corporation that had taken theirs. This pattern has repeated across the globe. From babies to children. From chocolate to water. What Nestle built was not just a corporation, but a system, one that transforms human necessity into corporate dependency, and suffering into revenue. And once you see the pattern, you can never unsee it. To Nestle's critics, the conclusion was unavoidable. The deaths of up to 1.5 million infants a year were treated as an acceptable cost of doing business. The infant formula scandal that followed the corporation for more than 3 decades was not an anomaly. It was a prototype. A rehearsal. Proof that the model worked. From poison formula to child slavery and water extraction, the scandals surrounding Nestle are not isolated ethical failures. They reveal a consistent operating system, identify the most vulnerable populations on Earth, engineer dependency, and convert basic human needs into industrial profit. The global boycott and the World Health Organization's International Code of Marketing of breast milk substitutes dealt Nestle a serious blow. But they did not change the company's philosophy. They forced adaptation. The lesson Nestle absorbed was not, "Stop exploiting." It was, "Do it more quietly." While public outrage focused on infant formula, the same model was scaled into far larger markets, cocoa and water. This marked the second and third acts of the Nestle story. The corporation accused of killing babies would soon face accusations of enslaving children and draining entire communities dry. The first of these was hidden inside Nestle's sweetest products. Kit Kat, Crunch, Aero, Toll House. Brands designed to evoke comfort, childhood, indulgence. Yet their core ingredient, cocoa, comes from one of the most violent supply chains on the planet. Nearly 70% of the world's cocoa is produced in just 2 countries, Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. Nestle, alongside Mars and Hershey, dominates this market. Nestle alone sources roughly 30% of its cocoa from this single, deeply unstable region. And this system, documented for decades by journalists, NGOs, and governments, is built on child labor, not as an exception, but as a structural necessity. In 2020, the most comprehensive evidence arrived. A study by NORC at the University of Chicago, funded by the U.S. Department of Labor, found that 1.56 million children were engaged in hazardous labor on cocoa farms in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. Hazardous labor is a sanitized term. The reality is brutal. Children, some as young as 10, work 12-hour days without pay. They wield machetes sharp enough to kill. They carry 100-pound sacks through tropical heat. They spray toxic pesticides without protection. Many suffer permanent injuries. Some vanish altogether. Even darker is the trafficking. Thousands of children are not working with their families. They are slaves. Traffickers lure or purchase children from poorer countries such as Burkina Faso, promising education or wages. Instead, they are sold to farm owners, imprisoned for years, beaten for trying to escape. Their lives disappear into supply chains that lead directly to Western supermarkets. Nestle has known about this for decades. The scandal first surfaced in the late 1990s. In 2001, the chocolate industry, including Nestle, signed the Harkin-Engel Protocol, a voluntary pledge to eliminate the worst forms of child labor by 2005. The deadline passed. It was postponed to 2008, then 2010, then 2020. Now, it stands at 2025. Every deadline has been missed. In 2005, 6 men from Mali sued Nestle in U.S. federal court. They alleged they had been trafficked as children and forced into slavery on cocoa farms supplying the company. The lawsuit accused Nestle of aiding and abetting slavery under the Alien Tort Statute. Nestle's defense was telling. The company did not deny that child slavery existed. It argued it was not responsible. Nestle claimed it was merely a Swiss buyer operating through intermediaries. It did not own the farms. Therefore, the suffering was not its concern. In June 2021, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Nestle's favor, a legal victory, not a moral one. The court dismissed the case on procedural grounds. It did not absolve Nestle of wrongdoing. But the evidence presented exposed a grim reality. Plaintiffs showed that Nestle understood the system perfectly. The company controlled pricing, wielded enormous economic leverage, and had the power to enforce reforms. Child labor, they argued, was not a flaw. It was the foundation. Cheap chocolate required cheap labor. Cheap labor required children. Nestle responded as it always does. Lawyers. Public relations. A polished initiative. In 2009, the company launched the Nestle Cocoa Plan, a 110 million Swiss franc program promising schools, training, and monitoring. On paper, it was exemplary. In practice, it preserved the core problem. The World Bank estimates that 60% of cocoa farmers in Côte d'Ivoire live in extreme poverty, surviving on less than $2 a day. As dominant buyers, Nestle and its peers have long suppressed cocoa prices. Farmers trapped by these economics face a brutal choice: exploit their own children or buy trafficked ones. Against this reality, the Cocoa Plan functions less as reform and more as camouflage. The 2020 NORC report confirmed it. Nearly half of child laborers in the region still do not attend school. And the pattern does not stop there. It reaches its most distilled form in Nestle's control over the most fundamental human necessity: water. Nestle is the largest bottled water company on Earth. From luxury brands like Perrier and S. Pellegrino to mass-market labels like Nestle Pure Life, the message is consistent: bottled water is modern, clean, superior, especially in developing countries. But Nestle does not create water. It extracts it. The company targets communities with clean groundwater, purchases small plots of land, drills industrial wells, and pumps millions of gallons, often paying little or nothing. That water is bottled in plastic and sold back to the population at enormous markups. The consequences are real. In Badi Dilwan, Pakistan, Nestle built a Pure Life plant in the early 2000s. Over years of extraction, local wells dried up. The water table collapsed. Families who had relied on free groundwater for generations were left with contaminated surface water, or forced to buy bottled water from the same corporation that took theirs. This pattern has repeated worldwide. From infants to children, from cocoa to water. Nestle has not built merely a corporation. It has built a system, one that turns human necessity into dependency, and dependency into profit. And once the pattern becomes visible, it cannot be unseen. The 2020 NORC report was the confirmation. 1.56 million children were still trapped in hazardous labor. Proof that the Nestle Cocoa Plan did not fail accidentally, it failed by design. The program monitors only a narrow slice of the supply chain and carefully avoids the real cause of the crisis: the poverty-level prices Nestle pays for cocoa. Prices so low that exploitation becomes inevitable. Critics argue the company's other sustainability initiatives follow the same script. The Water Stewardship Plan, for example, focuses on making Nestle's factories more efficient. Efficient for whom? Reduced costs benefit shareholders, not the communities whose aquifers are being drained. The plan never addresses the core issue: the extraction of millions of gallons of public water from drought-stricken regions in California, Pakistan, and France. Then there is the recycling pledge, described by activists as the most cynical maneuver of all. Recyclable, they argue, is a meaningless promise in a Philippine village with no recycling infrastructure. The pledge does not reduce plastic production. It shifts responsibility from corporation to consumer, from producer to victim. This leads to the final, haunting question surrounding the Nestle dynasty. Is this all part of a global conspiracy? The theories are endless. The most persistent, popular on Reddit and online forums, claims Nestle sits at the center of a secret cabal to privatize and control the world's freshwater supply. Former CEO Peter Brabeck's infamous statement that water is not a human right is treated as the smoking gun. His long-standing membership in the secretive Bilderberg Group is cited as evidence of coordination with global elites. According to the theory, Nestle is deliberately draining aquifers to manufacture scarcity, a future where humanity is forced to buy pure life water at monopoly prices. It is a terrifying narrative. But the reality, as documented by historians and financial journalists, is colder and far more disturbing. There is no secret conspiracy. There is only open-source capitalism. Nestle's real power is not hidden. It is public. It is itemized. It is visible in lobbying budgets and regulatory capture. The company spends millions every year in Washington and Brussels lobbying to weaken nutritional labeling laws, block taxes on sugary drinks, and undermine regulations restricting infant formula marketing. Its influence extends deeper. Nestle is one of the largest corporate funders of nutritional research, global health conferences, and projects within the World Health Organization and UNICEF. Critics call this what it is: a structural conflict of interest. A corporation heavily implicated in global obesity, diabetes, and infant malnutrition simultaneously funds the institutions tasked with solving those crises, ensuring a permanent seat at the table and a hand on the scale of regulation. The final verdict on the Nestle dynasty is not that it is a secret plot run by shadowy elites. It is something more efficient. Nestle is the most refined, successful, and amoral expression of 21st century global capitalism. Its history is not defined by a single evil family. There is no patriarch to shame, no dynasty to overthrow. There is only a corporate structure engineered for one purpose: perpetual growth. This machine has no morality in the human sense. It saw a dying infant in 1867 and recognized a business opportunity. It saw a starving, illiterate mother in Africa in 1977 and identified a new market. It saw a 10-year-old child in Côte d'Ivoire holding a machete and calculated a cost reduction. And it saw a public aquifer in a drought-stricken village and labeled it an undervalued asset. As critics like Corporate Accountability International argue, Nestle is not evil in the theatrical way of a comic book villain. It is something far more dangerous. It is systematically exploitative. Child slavery and water depletion are not bugs in the system. They are features. This is the true legacy of the Nestle dynasty, a rotating family of executives, managers, and shareholders who perfected a system that profits from the very crises it claims to solve. They sell health while driving obesity. They sell sustainability while ranking among the world's largest plastic polluters. And they built a 150-year-old, $105 billion empire on a product that saved infants, only to be accused, for the next half-century, of killing them. The boycott that began in 1977 continues today in more than 20 countries, a nearly 50-year testament to the global distrust attached to the Nestle name. The fight has now passed to a new generation. On TikTok, on Reddit, in shared lists of Nestle-owned brands to avoid, in viral clips of Peter Brabeck's own words. And for millions, Nestle's logo, the mother bird feeding her young, no longer symbolizes care. It has become the ultimate image of corporate hypocrisy. A predator, disguised as a nurturer. If you've made it this far, thank you for staying. Stories like this are uncomfortable for a reason. They aren't meant to entertain. They're meant to be remembered. Because once you see how these systems work, how profit is extracted from vulnerability, you start to recognize the pattern everywhere. Nothing in this story is ancient history. None of it is over. If you want more investigations like this, calm, factual, and unsanitized, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps this work continue, and it helps these stories reach people who might otherwise never hear them. Leave a comment if you want to add context, challenge the narrative, or suggest what story should be examined next. These conversations matter.